Well, let's begin tonight from Gwoza in Borno State, Nigeria's northeastern region, where residents of that community are now finding their way home after years of being displaced by the terrorist group Boko Haram. The United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Nigeria, Edward Callon, who has been touring the community as part of activities marking the World Humanitarian Day, was confronted with the people's most pressing needs.
Polka community is one of the 13 wards that make up Gwoza local government area of Borno State. Presently, about 94,000 displaced persons have returned to the community, picking up the pieces of their lives. While some of them live in makeshift camps, others live in what is left of their homes, which they abandoned for nearly 4 years. A major challenge to residents here is availability of water. On a daily basis, about 60,000 litres of water is taken to the community. But still, that is just like a drop in the ocean, as it hardly meets the people's water needs. On the other side of the village, these operators of the commercial borehole charge a fee for their services, which the residents say they can barely afford.
There's a borehole, but there are too many people. The reason we have sufficient supply right now is because of the raining season. Otherwise, we'll be out here on the queue for a minimum of 3 hours. Sometimes we are out by 12 midnight until the day breaks before we get the water.
The United Nations Humanitarian Coordinator in Nigeria believes the water challenge in Polka will remain a primary focus as more displaced persons are expected to arrive the community.
We have to combine various opportunities that exist here, looking for areas where we can get productive water systems, and also looking at other options like the water catchments, developments, etc. So we have to look at various approaches. But it's also critical that we work towards decongesting the camp so that we can reduce the pressure. What is clear to me is that water trucking is not sustainable. Yeah, it's not sustainable. We have to look for other solutions.
Seeking solution to the challenge, the Borno State government explains that efforts are on to rebuild 500 houses in neighboring Ngoshe, where Polka refugees will be relocated to.
We can decongest Polka. Polka has 94,000 people with limited water resources, and Polka is part of the Kere formation, and there is this challenge of extracting underground water in that Polka axis. But here in Ngoshe, there is enough water resources to meet the yearnings and expectations of the people, and for our people to pick up the pieces of their lives.
The traditional ruler Gwoza, whose predecessor was killed by the insurgents in 2014, commends the efforts of the government in the rebuilding process.
As he said, a long journey starts with a single step. So this is the single step that he is starting. So on behalf of myself and the entire people of Gwoza local government, we are thanking His Excellency, the Executive Governor of Borno State, who have shown concern to our people.
As the villagers are now relieved thanks to the rainy season, they are also optimistic that the resettlement projects will be fully completed before the end of the season.
In Benue State, the governor, Samuel Otom, is drawing the attention of the United Nations and civil society organizations to the plight of over 500,000 internally displaced persons, IDPs, in the state. In a statement through his spokesperson, the governor says his state has become the target of armed herdsmen whose attacks have led to humanitarian crisis, depleting the lean resources of the state. He explains that hundreds of lives have been lost, homes, schools and healthcare centers destroyed, leaving over 180,000 people in 8 IDP camps. The governor, however, lauds the efforts of the humanitarian groups and civil society organizations for their interventions in bringing succor to the IDPs, while also commending the Nigerian military for the ongoing Operation Real Stroke, in which some soldiers have been casualties. The 19th day of August every year is commemorated as the World Humanitarian Day. It is a day set aside to remember those that have lost their lives while providing humanitarian services to the vulnerable. In Abuja, Nigeria, the military, paramilitary and civil society organizations turned out in their numbers to pay tribute to humanitarian workers.
officials of the Nigerian military, the paramilitary and members of the civil society organization in Abuja embark on a road walk to commemorate the World Humanitarian Day. Adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, the World Humanitarian Day helps to raise awareness on the need to remember those who have lost their lives while providing humanitarian services to the vulnerable. Addressing the gathering shortly after the roadwalk, the Director General of NEMA, Engineer Mustafa Mehaja, stresses the need to protect humanitarian workers from any form of attack, just as the Secretary to the Government of the Federation decries the devastating effects of recent humanitarian crisis on Nigeria's economy.
The theme for this year's celebration is not a target, protection of civilians. Humanitarian workers will not be the target of any form of attack. They are working for humanity. They are neutral and impartial. We want to commend all the humanitarian actors and the military who have been working to ensure that insurgency in the northeast of Nigeria is brought to an end.
There is the need to demonstrate as well and demand greater humanity and create widespread support for humanitarian action across the globe. A lot of resources that indeed should have gone into economic activities development is oftentimes being spent unnecessarily in times of crisis, which will ordinarily not have been so if we were able to promote peace and also to prevent occurrences.
As at March this year, 5 humanitarian workers were killed and others missing in Borno State, northeast Nigeria. Hence the urgent call for the implementation of policies and programs that will mitigate the sufferings of humanitarian workers in taking center stage as the world marks the 2018 World Humanitarian Day.
Joining us on the news at 10 is E.A. Jonathan. She's the CEO of Cecil Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us on the news at 10.
Thank you.
I mean, on a day like this, World Humanitarian Day, is it safe to assume that many people who are in the business of, giving humanitarian aid perhaps feel frustrated with the seeming inability of warring sides or intermediaries to bring an end to major conflict?
I would say yes, but the nature of the work is such that you keep pushing, day after day. Humanitarian work has gone on almost as long as humanitarian conflicts or human conflicts have happened throughout the world. So that's always been on. The UN started in the 40s after the Second World War, and we've seen constantly just crises evolve, humanitarian crises change, take on a different nature. So those who work in that space, yes, there is what you call fatigue. So it's safe to say, bringing it home to Nigeria, definitely, we have a lot of humanitarian crisis. Around the world, for example, you have a displacement crisis, 65 million people displaced across the world. In Nigeria, official figures 1.8, but we know they're much higher. And there's not enough care for people in that space, who work in that space. I'm sure if you ask even the NEMA or the SEMA people across Nigeria, a lot of them do not have access to trauma counseling because they suffer what we call secondary trauma or vicarious trauma from constantly being out in the field. Imagine in a bomb attack, the first responders are the health workers, the NEMAs, and they're picking up the broken bodies, even the police, even the security forces. So definitely there is a sense, I think the problems are getting bigger, and one of the things we always say is the work not finished, it's just there. And it's increasing in number. So it is frustrating, but the nature of the work is such that, you take a deep breath and you just keep going.
If you were to describe Nigeria's humanitarian crisis, how would you put it as?
It's definitely escalating. And I personally think from what I see, from the way it's being managed, from what the government's focus is, it's election season, it's not going to get any better any soon, sadly. There are a lot of displaced people across Nigeria. There's a lot of focus on the northeast, and yes, there's quite a lot on there, but there's also quite a lot of, we saw the Benue report, Zamfara is there, Taraba, Adamawa, Plateau, and then other issues, other humanitarian issues down south as well. Rains are coming, floods. So we're going to see a lot more as time goes on, and of course climate change and its effects. So I would not say that it's improving. In fact, it's getting worse, and we're not managing our resources very well. And we seem, especially the governments and government officials, a lot of them seem focused on the wrong things, and their sense of it's sound bites we hear. We're not seeing that radical action that we need to see on the field.
How much would you say humanitarian workers are involved, especially with the attacks, pretty much like the victims of these attacks?
I mean, the numbers are increasing, sadly. And, you know, for me, when we talk about humanitarian workers, there's NGO workers, the civil society organizations. You've got NEMA, there's the national, and then you've got the state agencies as well. And I think some of the ways they're affected are very underreported. I mean, just last week, again, we heard about a NEMA official that was killed. We've heard about UN officials being attacked. Of course, 2011, we had the UN bombing. The UN house in Abuja was bombed. The culprits have never been caught. So, you know, these are some of the things we see. And it's increasing in intensity. Some are being kidnapped, held for ransom. And this is a growing trend, not just in Nigeria, but around the world. Funny enough, the theme for this year's World Humanitarian Day is not a target, and it's all about protecting civilians and protecting those who work in this space. The government needs to step up to its responsibility.
What do you make of the humanitarian actors, primarily the United Nations and perhaps other influential countries?
I think when it comes to protections for those who work in this space, in every country, the primary responsibility for security lies with the host government. So, for example, in Nigeria, the primary responsibility lies with Nigeria, you know, for those in the UN space and other humanitarian workers, both the local ones, those of us who work on the ground who are Nigerians ourselves, and then those who are coming from outside. So there's a lot of responsibility on the part of the government. The UN has its own security protocols. They have security advisories they send out to their staff to work on them. I believe they work in conjunction with other agencies to do that. I think so. There's a lot of work that the governments have to do. I personally think, I'm a ex-UN staffer myself, so I speak from experience. I feel that the UN in Nigeria needs to be a lot more, They need to be a lot more harder hitting with our governments in calling them to these responsibilities. Because it's not just about UN workers, it's about other NGO workers that are at risk. We've gone into certain areas, for example, you go into some camps, for example, there's not enough protection, even for the victims themselves. You're going in there as an aid worker. I mean, I was in Agatu in March, for example, and here we are shouting there's an anti-grazing law in that state. People were there was not much protection, and there were just cattle all over the field, taking over their rice farms.
How would you say this affects the morale of those who are involved in humanitarian aid?
Absolutely, it affects the morale negatively. And unfortunately, I think in Nigeria, we've become extremely desensitized and almost used to the idea that we have a government that does not necessarily care, in the sense that, or they don't always care. They will send out lots of officers. When there's a big shot coming into the field, you see the police and the soldiers coming to protect them. But the ordinary people and some of the ordinary workers don't always get those protections. That's not always the case in every state. It differs from state to state. If you ask for help, some of them come, some of them give you police escorts. In some cases, you have to make certain arrangements to have that. But it definitely affects the morale. But one of the things that humanitarian workers have learned to do, the UN has the resources in some ways to provide certain arrangements. For the smaller NGOs who work on the ground, like ours, we sometimes have to just work with intelligence reports, work with the communities to get what the news is about the security situation, and just make wise decisions to do that. But there's definitely a need for more investment in those areas.
All right, we'd like to thank you so much, E.A. Jonathan, CEO, Senso Foundation, for coming on the program.
Thank you very much.